Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Torchlight AI webinar looking at Afghanistan 1 year on from the Taliban takeover. My name is Anna Wilton, one of the directors of geopolitical intelligence here at Torchlight, where we use a combination of AI/ML technology and expert analysis to produce data-driven insights. I'm very pleased today to give you the opportunity to speak to Torchlight's head of Asia, Dr. Judith Jacob. Judith has extensive experience covering geopolitical and security developments across APAC, and particular expertise through her doctorate in the role ideology plays in the formation of terrorist groups. Also joining us on the panel is Maisie Morris, who works alongside Judith and has covered Afghanistan extensively as an analyst on our Asia team. Next slide, please. With that said, I'll hand you over to Maisie to kick off the discussion with an overview of the key events from the last year, before Judith moves on to look at the domestic and regional implications of those developments. Next slide, please, and over to you, Maisie.
Thanks, Anna. So the Taliban seized control of Kabul's presidential palace exactly a year ago today. And while the fall of the coalition-backed government sent shockwaves around the world, the takeover wasn't actually unprecedented. In fact, it seemed increasingly likely in the months and weeks preceding the fall of Kabul. The Taliban quickly began consolidating territories surrounding regional capitals as early as May, and captured border crossings with Tajikistan and Iran in late June and early July. The Taliban were galvanized by the near certainty that American troops would fully withdraw by the end of August, with the US confirming that 95% of its military personnel had already withdrawn by late July. What was more surprising, however, was the pace at which the Taliban advanced, especially since Washington had estimated only in June that former President Ghani's government would not fall for at least another 6 months. These assessments proved to be misguided, and after taking control of the first provincial capital on the 6th of August, the Taliban had captured 17 other provinces in an 8-day period before making their way to the outskirts of Kabul. The weeks immediately after taking Kabul saw the Taliban prioritize consolidating state and territorial control. All of Afghanistan had been captured by the 6th of September, when the Taliban announced they had taken Panjshir province, which was the country's last pocket of resistance. The Taliban also rapidly installed a Pashtun-dominated all-male government, which included Western-sanctioned individuals in core leadership positions. The Taliban's state-building efforts have, however, been stymied by severe economic crisis, which began after the takeover, with Washington immediately freezing Afghanistan's central bank assets held in the US worth $9.5 billion US dollars, and stopping shipments of hard currency. So then in spring, the Taliban significantly intensified their efforts to shore up internal unity and appeal to hardliners within its ranks. This was partly motivated by a lack of success in garnering Western support, with US President Biden issuing an executive order on the 11th of February outlining plans to donate half of the Taliban's frozen assets held in the US to a trust fund to provide aid for Afghan people. The other half would be used to compensate the families of 9/11 victims. This in turn saw the administration adopt more explicitly conservative policies, and on the 23rd of March, for instance, the Taliban announced that girls would no longer be allowed to attend schools, which attracted international condemnation. So despite efforts to consolidate their control of the country and retain internal support, the Taliban has had to grapple with growing instability in recent months. Economic hardship and insecurity has triggered large outward migration. NGOs estimate that around 4,000 to 5,000 people are crossing the border into Iran each day. Islamic State has also increased its attacks outside of their Nangarhar stronghold in an effort to undermine the Taliban's rule. These attacks intensified following the death of the group's leader in February, with IS launching a global campaign to avenge his death during Ramadan. The Taliban has also faced some increased pressure from a guerrilla insurgency waged by the National Resistance Front since the 7th of May, primarily in Panjshir. While it has managed to resist this pressure, it does indicate how the Taliban continue to face acute security threats on multiple fronts, which has compounded the country's humanitarian crisis and slowed any economic recovery. The UN reported on the 20th of July that 59% of the population now require international assistance, which is an increase of 6 million people compared to the start of 2021. So while the Taliban has largely consolidated control, the economic and security outlook for the country is pretty stark. So I'll now just speak in more detail about the domestic stability issues the Taliban face and the administration's attempts to consolidate power. So the outlook, as I've previously said, is not great, and the country faced a dramatic collapse following the Taliban takeover. Afghanistan saw GDP growth shrink by at least 20%. The graph here, which is based on World Bank figures, is a conservative estimate. Other institutions pegged fall as great as 30% in 2021. This is primarily the result of a halt to large portions of international aid provided by Western governments that made up around 40% of Afghanistan's GDP prior to the Taliban takeover. The Taliban has in recent months managed to stop the economic freefall. Levels of violence have dropped since it seized Kabul, allowing businesses to reopen. However, it still remains unable to provide adequate social services, including healthcare and education. The lack of funds means that many doctors and teachers have been staying home as they simply are not being paid. Similarly, educated Afghans, many of whom were technocrats within the civil service, have fled or have been sidelined in favour of the Taliban and their family members. The consequence of this is that there is poor decision making in the civil service and a lack of service delivery due to reduced technical competence. Government functions, from civil aviation to rural agriculture development, require specialists who are no longer available to help. One positive is the fact that corruption is reportedly down, which has benefited trade. There are now, for example, fewer reports of extortion of traders at border crossings, and the Taliban have reportedly removed requirements for traders to fill in paperwork when selling to Pakistan. These traders form a huge part of the informal economy, and this has enabled a small but steady stream of money into the country. Another bright spot is coal production. Afghanistan has benefited a little from the elevated oil and gas prices, with many countries increasing coal consumption as a result. Afghanistan has increased production at its coal mines, for instance, again, mainly selling to Pakistan. However, this is not enough to salvage the economy, and Afghanistan will be stuck in a low-level equilibrium of slow economic growth and remain vulnerable to famine and other exogenous shocks. The lives of its people are unlikely to get any better anytime soon, unfortunately, with the Taliban lacking the capabilities or the vision to improve the situation. So this begs the question, can they hold on to power in the longer term? And I think the answer to that question is yes, at least in the next year or so. This is basically because there are currently few alternatives. Afghans remain disillusioned with secular government, having experienced severe corruption and limited improvements to their lives under the previous coalition government. Also, those who oppose the regime, alongside those who worked for the Afghan National Security Forces, have been subjected to summary executions and enforced disappearances. There's also reports of arbitrary arrests, the detention of journalists, etc. There is more concerted resistance from the Islamic State Khorasan province, which Judith will speak about towards the end of the presentation, and the National Resistance Front. This is, however, relatively low and concentrated in a small number of provinces, Panjshir and Baghlan for the NRF, and Kunduz, which borders Tajikistan, and Nangarhar near Pakistan. The NRF has got loads of media attention by virtue of being led by Ahmad Massoud, who's the son of Ahmad Shah Massoud, who led many offensives against the Taliban in the 1990s. So this is in many ways a legacy movement, which doesn't really have a real power base. There are many ex-Afghan security force members in the group, and it does have the kind of skills and determination, but it lacks the military capabilities of the Taliban at this point. So to conclude, the Taliban will remain largely unchallenged in its hold of Afghanistan in the coming year. We will be monitoring the following points in more detail. Number one, the rise in the number and pace of attacks. Number two, the emergence of resistance groups, although the only chance groups like the NRF have is if the Taliban faces multiple insurgencies. And number three, avert factionalization in the Taliban. So I'll pass over to Judith now, who will give an update on the regional outlook.
Thank you so much, Maisie. I will now cover Afghanistan's relationship with Pakistan, India, and China. These relationships, as I'm sure you'll appreciate, are distinct. However, one common feature they all share is that they're forged by necessity. The US's departure has left a significant vacuum, which neighboring states need to fill. None of these nations have the luxury of taking positions of apparent moral purity or ignoring the Taliban entirely. They all want the Taliban to maintain a monopoly of force, ensuring stability within Afghanistan and preventing spillover effects into their own territories or the region more broadly. So, beginning with Pakistan, Pakistan has historically been Afghanistan's main benefactor in the post-war era. Pakistan's interest in Afghanistan largely stem from its desire to ensure domestic stability. A stable Afghanistan is one of the preconditions for a stable Pakistan. Pakistan, as you can see from the chart here, is one of the main export partners for Afghans, both in the formal and informal economy. But as you can see on the chart, the level of economic complexity through the goods sold is relatively low. But it shows that individual traders are likely being able to make a living through the selling of these very basic goods. And so this is improved, as Maisie has said in the previous section, under Taliban control, with corruption seemingly dissipating slightly. However, relations between the Taliban and Pakistan have been at a low point since they came to power. The Taliban have routinely defied both the governments of Prime Minister Imran Khan and the coalition now led by Shehbaz Sharif. This is largely because Afghanistan continues to provide a safe haven to the Tehrik-e-Taliban, an anti-Pakistan force. Pakistani reports claim that since the Taliban's takeover, attacks have risen by about 40%. In 2021, the TTP was responsible for at least 87 attacks in Pakistan, which killed 158 people. Security forces in Pakistan claim that these were all orchestrated and planned from Afghanistan. Pakistani security forces, however, retaliated in an unprecedented fashion with airstrikes in Afghanistan in April, and these killed civilians, a major escalation. It is arguable, though, that the civilian casualties were deliberate and intended to put pressure on the Taliban to crack down on the TTP. This, I should stress, is a significant departure from the usual tactics of the Pakistani military, which involve quietly asking the Taliban to move the group onto other parts of the country or away from the border, or to crack down on it without the Pakistanis striking first. However, in the coming months, it's unlikely that the Taliban will crack down on the TTP. There is significant loyalty between the two groups. The TTP pledged allegiance to the Taliban and supported its takeover. It's got strong interpersonal relationships, mainly ethnic bonds, or those forged together with the group in war. For its part as well, the Taliban does not want to isolate the TTP or anger it such that it forges a relationship with its enemy, Islamic State Khorasan province either. So resultantly, we're likely to see an escalation in violence on the border with more Pakistani military incursions and simultaneously a rise in TTP attacks in Pakistani territory in the months ahead. However, these deteriorating relations might give the USA a route back into managing terrorist activity in the region through working with Pakistani security services against a common enemy. For its part, Pakistan would likely welcome US assistance, with the caveat that it remains largely covert, given its government is preoccupied with managing its own financial crisis and political survival, though you could say that about the US as well. Though moving on to relations with India. When things are going badly for Pakistan, we can usually expect India to benefit in these situations. India has pursued a policy of rapprochement with the Taliban since it's come to power, and this relationship has been characterized by a combination of realism and political opportunism. For example, in June, India reopened its embassy in Kabul. It didn't officially recognize the Taliban, but the move shows it's clearly willing to deal with the group as the de facto leader of the country. Like Pakistan, it wants a relatively stable Afghanistan in order to keep India safe from extremist attacks. It wants the Taliban to rein in the Lashkar-e-Taiba, LET, or Jaish-e-Mohammed, JEM, who use the country as a base to train and to plan attacks. India and the Taliban also share a common enemy in ISK. As such, India is hoping that by cultivating closer relationship with the Taliban and providing aid to stabilize its rule, the Taliban will be able to take action against these threats to India. So far, the Indians have donated 20,000 tons of wheat, thousands of COVID-19 vaccines, and as you can see of the chart, billions of rupees. However, it should be noted that India is giving much more money to other countries in the region. So priority-wise, you can see that Afghanistan is just one amongst many, which will give you a sense of the importance of that relationship. For its part, India is also looking at cultivating closer relations with the Taliban, particularly when its relations with Pakistan are at a low ebb. This is where political opportunism comes into play. It will allow India to have strategic depth in Pakistan, particularly along its northern border, depriving Pakistan of a key ally, hopefully in the longer term. India will continue to leverage the promise of further investment in Afghanistan to keep the Taliban on side. However, this investment, which is likely going to take the form of building of key infrastructure and capital investment in Afghanistan's extractive industries, is unlikely to actually manifest unless the Taliban demonstrates it can maintain stability within the country and takes concrete action to crack down on LET and JEM. As such, India is going to be closely monitoring attacks in Kabul, particularly attacks on minority religious groups like the Sikhs, before it considers deepening ties further. So it's going to stay withholding deeper and closer relations in the longer term. Next slide, please. Like India, China's involvement in Afghanistan has come begrudgingly and with some appreciation as well for the political opportunism there, particularly needling the United States for its withdrawal. Alongside Pakistan and India, China ultimately values stability in Afghanistan because of its own domestic security concerns. However, its engagement, unlike India's or Pakistan's, is more selective. China is primarily concerned about Afghanistan being used as a base by Uyghur extremists to foment separatism or stage attacks in China. The main group it's concerned about is called the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, a relatively obscure and small entity. It's got several hundred fighters at most, with limited operational capacity. It routinely complains to the Taliban about ETIM activities, which in turn leads to a limited response from the Taliban, who move the group further away from the Chinese border, but don't do anything more than that, really. It's probable that the Taliban will take stronger measures if the group was actually launching attacks into China, but it honestly does not appear capable of doing that so far. It's also concerned about Chinese investment elsewhere in Central Asia, and an unstable Afghanistan will have a knock-on effect on Chinese projects, particularly in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. The rise in Chinese involvement in Afghanistan security, as a result, stems from its concerns that the US withdrawal has created an unstable environment, and its faith in Russia, who the Chinese have historically trusted and relied upon to take the lead on security matters on Afghanistan's frontiers, has deteriorated, particularly after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. China has begun building watchtowers and other military installations along Afghanistan's borders, notably on the Wakhan corridor near Tajikistan, following concerns that the Russian bases themselves are understaffed or of poor quality. So again, that really shows you that the Chinese are increasingly concerned, but not fully invested in the way that the Russians were at maintaining a full-scale presence, shall we say, on these frontiers. China, however, tends to rely more heavily on economic measures, and it will continue to give aid, though nowhere close to the levels provided by the US and its partners to Afghanistan. It will respond to humanitarian emergencies and purports to be conducting some investment in Afghanistan. However, I think that must be taken with a pinch of salt because its involvement in big infrastructure projects, notably the Mes-Aynek copper mines project, do not seem to have borne any fruit, with little progress on those fronts since that deal was inked in 2008. It's largely because of ongoing security concerns regarding attacks against Chinese workers and the inability of successive governments to ensure their safety. So in summary, further investment from all countries is contingent on two factors, namely that the Taliban has to ensure the country is not a safe haven for extremist groups, and that it can ensure the security of foreign workers in its borders. In the case of the former, it means preventing Afghanistan from being used as a base by groups like ETIM, LET, and JEM, and the TTP, not to forget them, to mount attacks. Afghanistan is likely to be able to demonstrate this to India and China, but this is due to the relative weakness of the groups that they find threatening, rather than because the Taliban is meaningfully able to crack down on these organizations. So in the case of Pakistan, it is unlikely, for the reasons that I've outlined earlier, that it will take actions against the TTP, leading to a further deterioration in that relationship. However, the Taliban will also have a much harder time ensuring the security of foreign workers in Afghanistan, particularly as groups like ISK single out Chinese workers as high-value targets for their operations. ISK knows that maintaining security around copper and Lithuanian sites are crucial for the Taliban and will thus seek to undermine it. It is also likely that India and China will continue to provide high levels of aid in the absence of a US presence, but they will not match that level of giving simply because these countries will not be able to muster that with other security and aid commitments elsewhere. So that concludes our discussion on Afghanistan's relationships with its neighbors, and I will move on to our final section on the terrorism threat and its outlook there. So as you can see from the laundry list of groups that I read out in the previous section, Afghanistan is home to numerous organizations that pose a significant regional threat. I should stress, though, that the threat that they pose internationally, and particularly to Western states, is comparatively limited at this juncture. The two groups that I'm going to talk about in this section are Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State's Khorasan province, as they are the two groups with any semblance of global aspiration. So beginning with Al-Qaeda, Ayman Zawahiri's death has put the spotlight back onto the group. While the airstrikes were successful, it highlights the fact that Al-Qaeda was behaving with such impunity, with its leaders living relatively openly in Kabul, apparently advising the Taliban as well. It also demonstrates the long-lasting and really, really strong historic links the two organizations have with each other. The Taliban will not take action against Al-Qaeda, leading to continued outrage from the international community and thus prolonging sanctions against the Taliban. However, it's important to remember that although Al-Qaeda has been behaving with impunity within Afghanistan, its capabilities are extraordinarily limited at this point. Its ability to conduct attacks on Western targets are low, and according to a US intelligence estimate from earlier this year, it will take something like 2 years of uninterrupted rebuilding efforts for the group to be able to continue to launch an attack of any scale on US soil. Furthermore, the lack of action from Al-Qaeda, the lack of headline-grabbing spectacular attacks, also diminishes its appeal to new supporters, thus ceding ground further to the Islamic State weakening in the long run. It will, however, continue to provide, from its perch in Afghanistan, spiritual guidance to its offshoots in Northwest Africa, Yemen, Somalia, and Kenya, but it's no longer really capable of providing significant amounts of arms, funding, or operational support and guidance in that sense. The group will keep a relatively low profile, I think, in the coming months, retreating to its strongholds in the south and east of Afghanistan, and will be preoccupied with its leadership selection as its Shura Council convenes. Despite Al-Qaeda's historic prominence in Afghanistan, Islamic State remains the biggest threat domestically and internationally, though I should again caveat there that that international threat is, in the grand scheme of things, relatively low. Islamic State Khorasan province overarching aim remains to undermine and ultimately replace the Taliban. However, given this aim, its effectiveness remains confined to Afghanistan and its immediate neighbors, notably Pakistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. ISK delegitimizes the Taliban in its propaganda. Most recently, it simultaneously mocked Ayman Zawahiri's death and blamed the Taliban for facilitating the US strike. It's also attempted to recruit, often successfully, disgruntled Taliban fighters, Uzbek and Tajik nationals. It's carried out attacks in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan for the first time in April and May this year as part of a campaign called the Revenge of Two Sheikhs. This illustrates its attempt, I think, to be a regional rather than a local group. But its aspirations beyond that, I think, right now are relatively slim, at least in the coming year or so. So the absence of US or Western targets more broadly since the NATO withdrawal has resulted in ISK turning its attention more so to domestic minority religious groups and security forces in the region. From January 2020 to July 2021, ISK conducted something like 83 attacks, resulting in 309 fatalities. But as our graph shows, this tempo in the last year has remained high since the withdrawal of NATO forces. What has changed are the targets, and these have shifted to, as I said, minority religious groups, Taliban-controlled mosques and preachers, and I think in the longer term, Chinese businesses and investments. And these will be specifically intended to hinder the Taliban's efforts to secure international recognition and demonstrate to potential partners that it does not have a monopoly on force. It is thus unlikely that the Taliban will be able to completely contain the ISK threat in the coming months, perhaps in the coming year. But the level of attack resultantly will remain high, impeding investment. That said, ISK's ability to establish a firm base in the country will be really difficult, at least in the coming 12 months, because if it does, it will largely trigger, I think, US-led airstrikes or other involvement from Western forces, be it drones or other forms of containment of ISK.